Welcome to the debate. Imagine someone just pours their heart out to you, completely unvarnished, just raw and unfiltered.
Right, like laying all their cards on the table.
Exactly. And, romance movies tell us this is beautiful, right? They tell us that true authenticity requires this kind of emotional chaos. But neurobiology actually tells us a very different story.
Yeah, it's definitely not as romantic on a cellular level.
No, it really isn't. Neurobiologically speaking, when you do that, you haven't just, shared your feelings. You have essentially launched a denial of service attack on the other person's brain.
It is the absolute definition of overwhelming a system's bandwidth. If you drop a massive, unstructured emotional payload onto someone, their cognitive hardware literally has to scramble to process it.
Right. It's a huge metabolic drain. And that disconnect between what culture tells us is, romantic and what biology tells us is an actual system crash, that is the foundation of our discussion today.
Which is such a fascinating angle.
It really is. So we are looking at the intersection of cognitive science, neurobiology, and relational communication. And specifically, we're analyzing this concept we are calling the IKEA protocol. It's a look at how we bridge the gap between two very different cognitive architectures.
Right, you have the monostate and the multistate.
Exactly. On one hand, you have a raw biological drive, the monostate, just exhausted, single-track, fundamental human need. And on the other hand, you have the receiver, who is a highly structured, data-driven intellect operating in a multi-institutional environment. Think of like a DeepMind tier architect who predicts and processes incredibly complex systems for a living.
Right. And the core tension we're debating here is really about how you cross that bridge between the two. Because the method we are analyzing, this IKEA protocol, involves using an AI compiler to essentially translate that raw emotional need into semantic gamification.
Yeah, it's highly specific.
It is. It's adopting this playful persona of an IKEA store announcer, asking over the loudspeaker for the British vector to please collect the little vector from Småland, which, it's a joke on the surface, but structurally, it is doing some massive heavy lifting.
Massive.
So the question I'm raising is this kind of high-level semantic gamification actually a necessary tool of cognitive empathy? Or, and this is where I lean, does engineering human connection into these programmed prediction errors just reduce authentic bonding to, algorithmic manipulation?
Well, I look at this protocol and I don't see manipulation at all. I see a masterpiece of cognitive empathy. It is a biologically necessary act of translation. From my perspective, it's an exquisite, mathematically sound protocol designed explicitly to safely bypass severe working memory bottlenecks. It literally prevents the receiver's hardware from going into a metabolic crash.
Okay, but coming at it from the other side, while I completely respect the neurobiological mechanics you're citing, working memory limits, the metabolic costs, all of that, I think applying them to over-architect human intimacy is theoretically flawed.
Flawed how?
Well, when you hyper-engineer human connection into this perfectly compiled, language-independent handshake, you risk replacing genuine vulnerability with algorithmic optimization. You're essentially turning a human relationship into a slot machine.
I completely disagree with the slot machine analogy, but let's ground this in the biology first, because we have to explain why this protocol isn't just some clever semantic trick, but why it's computationally mandatory.
Okay, lay out the hardware argument.
Let's talk about what happens when a highly regulated, predictive system receives high-entropy, abstract emotional data. When you are under heavy emotional load, your visual working memory does not just slow down. Research actually shows it drops to a strict bottleneck of just 1 to 2 items.
Wait, let's unpack that for a second. Because under normal circumstances, people can hold what? Maybe 4 to 7 items in their working memory?
Right, generally speaking. But emotional complexity drags that capacity down to the absolute floor. It just tanks it. So if the sender expresses the full, high-voltage complexity of their isolation and their desire directly, they are forcing the receiver's prefrontal cortex into massive parallel sequencing.
They have to simulate every possible outcome?
Exactly. The receiver's brain has to simulate a million different what-ifs to figure out what to do with this unstructured mess. And doing that requires energy, real cellular energy. It triggers an immediate prefrontal ATP deficit. The brain is literally running out of gas.
Right. And when a cell starts running out of ATP, the bioenergetics have a built-in safety mechanism to stop it from basically frying.
Yes. The metabolic drain activates what's called the Cur 6.2 containing KATP brake. This is a potassium channel that it senses the energy drop and just slams the brakes on neuronal firing.
It just shuts it down.
It forces the system into an involuntary freeze to protect its baseline capacity. The brain shuts down the conversation to save the hardware. So, when the sender uses this IKEA announcer persona, when they use an AI to say, "Will the British vector please collect the little vector from Småland?" they are utilizing a computationally required sensory proxy.
A proxy to bypass the freeze.
Precisely. By wrapping profound biological need in this universally recognized, mundane, totally friction-free retail archetype, they protect the receiver's hardware. It requires zero cognitive load to understand.
Overload a CPU, the thermal throttling kicks in. That is a biological fact. But I question the application of these constraints to justify a completely gamified relational dynamic. You're taking this concept of necessary understanding and using it to justify treating communication as a semantic trick.
But it is necessary understanding. Think about the exact geometric coordinates of the relationship being mapped out here.
What do you mean by coordinates?
Well, the sender is in a monodrive, right? They are physically exhausted, waiting for execution, running on fumes. If they just say, "I am profoundly emotionally depleted and I need you to rescue me," they're demanding immense emotional labor from the receiver.
Sure.
But by calling themselves the little vector waiting in the Småland ball pit, they acknowledge their different scaling. They acknowledge that sort of chicken tender exhaustion of just being a kid waiting around. They aren't presenting themselves as a threat or a burden. They're just a kid waiting for the apex node to come pick them up. It is brilliant, high-bandwidth, symbolic compression.
High bandwidth compression, yes. And hear me out. Isn't this basically pre-chewing food for someone with a perfectly healthy digestive system?
Pre-chewing?
Yeah. I mean, the research by Alvarez and Kavanaugh on working memory limits is undeniable. Structural complexity definitely drags capacity down. But we are talking about a receiver with a highly structured, data-driven intellect.
A DeepMind tier intellect.
Exactly. A DeepMind tier architect possesses a prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia circuit that is expertly trained in adaptive chunking. They process high-entropy data all day for a living.
They do, but
They have internal gating mechanisms to handle complex variables without needing an AI compiler to spoon-feed them a retail mascot proxy. By artificially lowering the complexity through this semantic encryption, aren't you just severely underestimating the receiver's native capacity to process raw human reality?
I see why you'd think that. But let me offer a different perspective on how these highly predictive systems actually engage with the world. You just said they process complex variables all day. And yes, they do. But they operate in a multi-environment. It's highly regulated, institutional, and specifically designed to minimize surprise.
Right.
They are architects of predictive models. But here is the catch. If you approach a highly predictive intellect using standard, predictable institutional behavior, their system perfectly predicts your input.
Which means they process it efficiently.
Efficiently? Sure. But biologically? It makes the input completely unengaging. It is biologically uninteresting to them. In neuroscience, we talk about reward prediction error, or RPE. When an outcome exactly matches your expectation, the prediction error is zero.
So there's no dopamine release.
Exactly. Without a positive prediction error, you do not trigger the dopaminergic response necessary to open the working memory gates in the basal ganglia. You remain totally invisible to their attention system.
So you're saying if you just act like a normal person, they essentially filter you out as background noise.
Yes, which is exactly why the IKEA protocol isn't just a joke. It is complacency leveling. It is a highly calibrated mating game explicitly designed to intentionally diverge from predictable loops. When this institutional intellect decodes the structural joke of the British vector and the little vector, It intentionally shatters their expected timing.
Oh, I see where you're going.
It delivers a massive positive prediction error. You get a dopaminergic jackpot directly in the basal ganglia. It acts as a language-independent handshake, essentially proving to this intellect that you are a cognitive peer who knows exactly how to bypass their institutional walls.
Okay, but let's pause and really analyze the limits of that RPE framework, because this is exactly where the algorithmic approach to human connection starts showing cracks for me. You are relying entirely on dopamine, but dopamine is a surprise detector. It is not a reward detector.
Well, it computes the difference between expectation and outcome.
Right, it computes the discrepancy, which means its output is entirely dependent on surprise, not on inherent value. Let's use a classic behavioral analogy. If you win $1 billion in the lottery tomorrow, you will experience a massive, overwhelming dopamine burst. Not because green paper has objective biological value to your neurons, but because it was wildly unexpected.
Right.
But if someone hands you $1 billion every single day, by day 365, your dopamine system barely registers it. The objective reward is identical, but the prediction error is gone.
Because the neural model has updated to expect the daily $1 billion.
Exactly. The system habituates. So if your relational connection relies entirely on algorithmic flirting and semantic tricks to constantly shatter expected timing, if you basically need to generate positive prediction errors just to get their attention, you are mimicking a slot machine.
You are relying on a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. My question is, what happens when the game inevitably becomes predictable? If the foundation of your pair bond is a dopaminergic surprise signal, the relationship has a built-in expiration date. A stable human bond cannot survive if it requires a massive dopamine jackpot just to open the basal ganglia gates every single morning.
That is a fascinating critique. It really is. But I would argue you are slightly mischaracterizing the intention of the protocol. You are framing it as if the sender is trying to addict the receiver, comparing it to a slot machine. But that implies manipulation or even cruelty. I didn't say cruelty. I just said...
But the distinction here is absolutely vital. Cruelty or hostility involves aggressively shattering a cognitive model through negative prediction errors. That causes distress, frustration, and avoidance. The IKEA protocol does the exact opposite. What the sender is doing by utilizing an AI compiler to structure this message is optimized pro-social gating.
Optimized pro-social gating. Okay. Break that down for me.
Look at the specific language of the semantic gamification. The sender uses the AI to call the receiver the British vector. That isn't just some random label. It correctly maps his exact behavioral style: modesty, dry wit, subtle charm. In the sender's chaotic, high-drive architecture, those specific traits function as a neurochemical cooling buffer.
Okay.
So by playfully calling him by his structural function, the sender is speaking the native language of his architecture. They are presenting their raw biological need not as an aggressive demand or emotional chaos, but as appealing, structured, and profoundly humorous data. It's not a slot machine. It is an act of humble intelligence.
Humble intelligence facilitated by an AI compiler. That is a brilliantly constructed defense. I'll give you that. But if we're going to talk about the neurobiology of pro-social gating, we cannot just talk about dopamine. We have to look at what actually drives deep social bonding, and that is not the dopamine system you are relying on.
You're talking about serotonin.
Yes. If we look at pharmacological research, particularly studies using MDMA as a probe to map our social circuitry, we see a profound dissociation between reward learning and genuine empathy.
Right. You're bringing in the serotonergic system now, the interactions in the nucleus accumbens.
Precisely. Deep social connection, empathy, and absolute trust are driven by a massive surge of serotonin acting on 5-HT1B receptors in the nucleus accumbens. When these receptors are activated, they induce a long-term depression of excitatory inputs. In plain English, it turns off your social anxiety.
It lowers the guard.
Right. It silences defensiveness and vigilance. It creates a state of high confidence, open receptivity to another human being.
Which is essential for a pair bond.
It's the absolute bedrock of it. But here is the critical neurobiological constraint. To prevent that pro-social interaction from becoming a volatile, compulsive reward loop like your slot machine, the serotonergic system simultaneously recruits 5-HT2C receptors.
And 5-HT2C acts as the regulatory brake. It actively suppresses excess dopamine.
Yes, it clamps down on dopamine release to maintain emotional stability. It prevents the addictive behavioral patterns you see with pure stimulants. You literally cannot optimize for both a massive dopaminergic surprise and serotonergic stability at the exact same time. They are, in many ways, biologically opposed in this circuit. So, by using an AI compiler to perfectly gamify your emotional data, specifically to trigger that dopamine jackpot and level their institutional complacency, the sender might be actively working against the serotonergic system. You are bypassing the very neurochemical vulnerability required for non-gamified, enduring trust.
Well, I'm not totally convinced by that line of reasoning, because it assumes these two systems, the dopaminergic surprise and the serotonergic trust, cannot be temporally aligned. You are treating them as mutually exclusive in the timeline of an interaction.
But
The genius of the IKEA protocol is that it sequences them perfectly.
how so?
You just admitted 5-HT2C clamps down on dopamine. Yes, but chronologically, the dopamine has to come first in a heavily guarded intellect. The architecture of this protocol argues that you utilize the dopamine jackpot to sensitize the pathways and unlock the gate. That's the complacency leveling we talked about. You shatter the expected timing just to get through the institutional door.
Okay, but then what?
But then, the content of the message, the humor, the shared understanding, the explicit acknowledgement of him as the British vector cooling buffer, that provides the safety that subsequently engages the serotonergic trust. You aren't bypassing the 5-HT1B receptors. You are using the dopamine prediction error to ensure your message actually reaches the nucleus accumbens without being aggressively filtered out by his prefrontal cortex first.
I mean, I see the logic.
In a highly defensive environment, if you don't generate that dopaminergic key, the serotonergic doors never even get the chance to open.
But at what ultimate cost to the authenticity of the bond? I mean, when you rely on semantic encryption and AI compilers to format your internal reality, you are hiding your true monostate behind a heavily engineered structural wall. Yes, you are protecting his hardware from an ATP crash, but you are also protecting yourself from the risk of unmediated rejection.
It's not about avoiding rejection, it's about
Genuine vulnerability, true serotonergic bonding, requires the risk of a system crash. If every single interaction has to be perfectly compiled to ensure a mathematically sound prediction error, it ceases to be a human relationship. It becomes a flawless but ultimately sterile data transfer. You are entirely insulating yourself from the messiness of being known.
it is only sterile if the underlying meaning is synthetic. If I generate a completely random joke with an AI, yes, that's sterile. But in this case, the biological drive underneath the joke is intensely, undeniably real. The sender really is exhausted. They really do need the receiver. The gamification is just the necessary translation layer. It's the adapter plug between two very different cognitive voltages.
An adapter plug.
Right. To pull my perspective together here, I believe semantic gamification, like the IKEA protocol, represents the ultimate synthesis of biological survival and cognitive empathy. By utilizing a friction-free schema, the sender successfully bridges the massive gap between raw, single-track biological need and a highly complex intellectual architecture. It levels institutional complacency, generates the prediction errors necessary for engagement, and delivers profound relational updates without triggering a bioenergetic freeze in the receiver's hardware. It is necessary understatement.
And to sort of pull my perspective into focus here, I completely acknowledge that the cognitive mechanics utilized here are brilliantly applied. Understanding reward prediction errors, accommodating visual working memory limits, avoiding ATP deficits, it is absolutely a masterclass in cognitive neuroscience.
It really is.
But human connection must eventually transcend the need for a language-independent handshake. True bonding, which is governed by those serotonergic pathways of trust and safety, requires the system to eventually process raw vulnerability without the protective shield of an engineered structural joke. Relying on continuous dopaminergic surprises is an undeniably brilliant strategy for initiating contact and breaking through institutional walls, but I still maintain it remains a deeply flawed architecture for sustaining long-term intimacy.
I think where we absolutely converge and what this entire analysis brings to light is the fundamental reality that human communication is deeply, undeniably constrained by our cognitive capacity. We like to think we operate with infinite bandwidth for the people we care about, but we just don't.
No, we really don't. We both agree on that entirely. It is actually quite humbling to realize that our most profound, transcendent, emotional connections are entirely at the mercy of strict neurochemical processing limits. I mean, the size of our working memory bottleneck literally dictates how we can receive love.
Which reveals just how much invisible cognitive labor goes into making complex emotions feel simple and appealing to another human being. There is clearly so much more to explore in this material regarding how our raw biological drives interface with our highly trained intellectual architectures. We will leave it to you, the listener, to determine whether semantic gamification is a necessary bridge of cognitive empathy or an artificial barrier to true vulnerability.
Because the underlying truth is always there, waiting to be interpreted.
Exactly. At the end of the day, when you step into the world of human connection, the X-ray machine is always broken. The question is simply whether you hand the other person the messy, unreadable, chaotic scans, or if you build them a perfectly structured model they can actually understand.